First released in 1993, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening is one of Game Boy's most iconic games. At a time when the Zelda formula itself was still being refined and portable Nintendo hardware still in its early days, Link's Awakening stood apart as a unique entry in the series. And now Link's Awakening returns for Nintendo Switch, boasting brand new visuals, a remarkable new soundtrack, quality of life improvements galore, and refined gameplay. Yet in public showings prior to release, it became clear that technical shortcomings might be an issue here. Thus today we're putting it to the test to see how it's improved since these earlier showings, while also discussing the original Game Boy version and directly comparing the new game against the DX release on Game Boy Color. So join me as we journey back into one of Link's most enjoyable adventures. When Game Boy launched in 1989, Nintendo helped change the face of portable gaming forever. It was suddenly possible to enjoy near NES level games on a portable system. Now it wasn't as technically advanced as say the Atari Lynx, but it was still a capable little machine. Now early on, most titles released for the system felt somewhat compromised and simplified next to its bigger brother. But over time, developers slowly started to overcome these limitations, delivering larger, more complex games such as Super Mario Land 2's 6 Golden Coins, which sees Mario visiting a series of unique stages unlike anything else in the series, along with Kirby's Dream Land, the first game in the Kirby series. But it was The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening that truly demonstrated the potential of the platform. It's a full-size Zelda experience that wouldn't feel out of place on the Super NES, despite the simplified visuals. You get a large, detailed overworld to explore with richly shaded tiles and sprites taking full advantage of the system, along with 8 sizable dungeons and a brilliant soundtrack. Yes, those 8-bit limitations are evident throughout, with few frames of animation, screen-by-screen scrolling, and lack of slopes, but it stands out as one of the most ambitious portable games ever made at time of release. Years later, a DX version was released for Game Boy Color with full compatibility for the original black and white Game Boy as well. A new dungeon, the Color Dungeon, was included and accessible only on Game Boy Color hardware, however. This is the version we'll be using in comparisons today, as it has stood as the definitive release for decades. But just this year, Nintendo announced Link's Awakening would receive a complete remake on Nintendo Switch, and at last it has arrived. Developed as a collaboration between Nintendo and Grezzo, Link's Awakening on Switch makes the jump to fully 3D visuals presented from an overhead perspective. This new game features a wealth of modern visual techniques which lend the world a tilt-shifted, miniaturized appearance. It's a beautiful realization of the original aesthetic that feels fresh yet authentic. But before we more closely examine the game's visuals, let's discuss the basics, and that means resolution. Link's Awakening utilizes a dynamic resolution system. It's a smart choice, but in practice it has little impact on the overall presentation. The reason? Well, for all intents and purposes, there's only 2 real resolution points where the game tends to settle. Let's look at an example. When you first enter this house, the pixel count is full 1080p. Pick up and throw a pot, however, and it drops to 972p, the typical resolution seen while exploring indoor areas. When you leave the house, however, the resolution changes rapidly within a few frames. It starts at 1080p when you first exit, and cycles down until it hits a lower resolution. The average resolution during the overworld sequences, however, is just 720p. So during normal gameplay, the game hangs at 720p most of the time, while interior areas can hit 972p. 1080p is also possible, but it's rather uncommon and typically drops below this very quickly. And it's similar in portable mode, where the game tends to run at 720p indoors while dropping to 576p in busier conditions. It may even go lower than this, but I haven't found an example yet. So image quality is a tad soft then, but it works well enough thanks to the overhead view, which minimizes distant pixel shimmering. So in that sense it works. It's certainly sharper than Yoshi's Crafted World, that's for sure. But pixel counts are just a small part of the overall presentation. So let's move on to the rest of the visual package. The first thing that really strikes me here is the devotion to capturing the color scheme and mood of the Game Boy Color version of the game, which is why direct comparisons with that version are so fascinating. Now before we begin, I want to note that all comparison footage we'll be using was captured via the brilliant GBA Consolizer system from Woozle. This utilizes a Game Boy Advance motherboard paired with an FPGA-based add-in board, which intercepts video signals from the GBA to produce a crystal clear HDMI output. So, let's begin here on the beach. First, note how the wavy texture pattern representing sand has been duplicated in the new game, while the contrast between the blue ocean, sandy beach, and orange-tinted stone has been retained. Also check out the footprints left by Link in the remake. Now as we climb the stairs, banana trees with their contrasting colors are featured prominently, and it's this strong contrast between colors that is key to the visual design in Link's Awakening. The Game Boy Color was limited in terms of how many colors per tile and per screen it could display. Now the artists working on this remake had no such constraints, but the game still retains this signature approach to color design, and it works extremely well. To pull this off without producing repetitive patterns or overly harsh color combinations, the development team focused primarily on material types and the usage of shadow and light. Specular highlights in particular play a huge role in the visual design here and lend the scenery a more three-dimensional appearance. Notice the white glint of light playing off various objects, including the tops of trees and plants, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The material choices are also interesting. The world has a rather glossy appearance, lending the game an almost toy-like aesthetic, as if it were built from plastic. More diffuse material, such as the sandy beach, does exist in the game, but the gloss is typically ramped up in many scenes. Now this isn't usually a desirable look in modern 3D games, but it works extremely well here due to the selected visual style and the toy-like aesthetic. And it becomes even more evident when exploring interiors such as this with its shiny tiled floor texture. Now if we jump back to the village, note how closely the object placement in the new game follows the original Game Boy release. Grezzo retains the tile-based design of the map. Each fence post, bush, or clump of grass occupies exactly the same space within the world. Even the animated double flower tile is realized in this new game. Basically, the world shares the same structure of the original tile map, which is key to its overall design, but the artists poured effort into minimizing the tiled look through smart modeling and texturing. Note how uneven stone walls appear in the new game. It's difficult to find a long straight edge as a result, even though the game itself is broken up into a grid-like structure. Discussing the structure of the world also brings me to the increase in field of view. The camera is raised and tilted while the viewport is expanded to 16:9. I found that this gives you a better lay of the land, so to speak. When standing in different parts of the map, for instance, you can now see more of the world around you, making it easier to fully understand the overall layout and position of objects. For instance, while standing here in the field on Switch, you can see the other side of the trees in the nearby phone booth, something that is not possible in the Game Boy original. Then there's the scrolling. Game Boy is divided up into a series of individual screens. The game scrolls between each screen, but it does not scroll freely as it does in the remake or games like A Link to the Past on Super NES. It functions more like the first Zelda on NES in that sense. Now the remake uses a delayed bounding box of sorts. Essentially, Link remains center most of the time, but as you continue walking in any one direction, the camera slowly shifts to reveal more of the scene, pushing Link further to the opposite side of the image. This always ensures that you have a wide view of the area in the direction of travel. The camera work in general is something that works supremely well here. Dungeons are often broken up into individual screens like we see on Game Boy, but larger areas within these dungeons now feature free scrolling, just like the overworld. This also applies to the strange little side-scrolling segments that appear in many dungeons. They now scroll freely. The art is also faithfully translated here. The off-model Goombas from the original game with their weird little smirk have been fully recreated here on Switch. There are plenty of other nice touches present in the visual design. For instance, Link's Awakening attempts to simulate indirect illumination. or light generated indirectly by another surface lit by a more direct source like the sun. In this case, the walls in this desert area take on an orangish hue as a result of the sunlight reflecting off the sand. What's interesting about this game is the way it applies this on a per tile set basis. Take this area, between the desert and the plains. On this side, the wall has a greenish hue from the grass, but on the other side, the wall takes on more of an orange hue from the sand. As you travel between these 2 points, however, you can see the game transitioning between them. It's a neat little detail, I think. Shadows are also supremely well implemented. Scenery and objects all present clean shadows mostly free of visible artifacts. It may simply be that we're looking at a shadow map with a single cascade here, where the fixed camera angle eliminates the need for multiple cascades. But it could be using another solution as well. Either way, the results are excellent. I also appreciate the subtle indirect shadow from Link and other enemies. Note the soft, diffuse shadow playing off the wall as he walks back and forth in this area, in addition to his much sharper projected shadow. Again, it helps further ground the characters within the game world. Then there are the particle effects such as smoke and fire. Not only are these effects well animated and very smoothly rendered, but they appear to self-shadow while taking on the color of the surrounding area as well. Note how there's a visible yellow hue present here in the smoke cloud. There's plenty of other small details present throughout the game as well, but the point is, when you take everything and put it together, you end up with something that feels rather consistent. Now I can admit, this style may not appeal to everyone, and it's certainly not perfect, but personally, I feel the team has done an excellent job of translating the original game to a new style in 3D. That said, I do have some minor complaints. For instance, character movement. The team decided to use a stark 8-way movement without transitional animations, which means when you change direction, Link changes position immediately. This can appear rather jarring at first, I feel, but at the same time, it results in a rather responsive game that is more in line with the way the original Game Boy version works. The real disconnect here stems from the fact that you can only control Link using the analog stick, so the free movement of the analog stick combined with this 8-way directional system results in something that feels a little strange. This is one case where I feel that D-pad support should be included for optimal gameplay, and hopefully this can be addressed in the future. In addition, I was disappointed by the lack of options in general. If you tab over to the system menu here, you really only have the option to save and load your game. There's no music volume adjustment, and things like the depth of field, although I do love the look of it, may not appeal to everyone, so it would be nice to have the option to disable it. Still, despite these minor issues, I feel the quality of life improvements and other new features help make up for any shortcomings. Case in point, item management. In the original game, every item is a unique item that can be assigned to one of 2 action buttons, which makes sense in the case of the Game Boy. The problem is, on Game Boy, you need to shuffle your items around constantly. So if you want to pick up a heavy rock, for instance, you need to equip the bracelet. Want to jump? You need to equip the feather. As you progress, you'll find yourself swapping items on a constant basis. What's worse, the game constantly bombards you with messages if you don't have the right item equipped to perform a certain action. It's certainly a relic of its time. In the remake, however, things work differently. Certain items, such as the feather or the bombs, can still be equipped, this time to the X or Y button, but other actions are permanently mapped. The shield is always on the right trigger, running is always on the left. Your sword is always assigned to the B button, and things like the power bracelet are automatically active, so hoisting large objects once you've obtained it is never an issue. In addition, the map system has been greatly refined. The resolution of the image used to depict the map is now high resolution enough that you can comfortably make out every area in the game from this view. It's almost as if you could play it from this super zoomed out perspective. Then there's the soundtrack. The original tunes were retained, but new tracks were created for this game with more of an orchestral flair. It sounds great, I feel. The color dungeon really caught my attention as well, as this was originally a remix of the dungeon theme featured in the very first Zelda game on NES. Take a listen. So the game looks great, sounds great, and plays better than ever, but unfortunately there is one more thing to discuss, and it's here where the development team falls a tad short. I am of course talking about performance. So, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the E3 build of the game was already rather unsteady. In this build, outdoor areas were running almost entirely at 30 frames per second, with occasional spikes to 60, due to its use of double buffer VSync. It really didn't feel great. Thankfully, the final game has improved dramatically, but perhaps not to the degree I'd hoped. Basically, it runs similarly to the Gamescom build I played in August, but the root of these issues is what I find most curious. Basically, during normal gameplay, you'll notice large drops in performance throughout. It basically fluctuates from 60 frames per second down to 30 frames per second. So this area here around Bottle Grotto is basically the slowest area in the game by far, and if it was the only thing that you saw from early framerate tests, you might draw a conclusion that the game runs really poorly. Now, for whatever reason, the swamp seems to be pushing the switch from all sides, leading to these significant and sometimes sustained drops, and it looks pretty bad, but there is a silver lining here. Most other areas in the game run much faster overall, but there are still some rather strange things happening with the frame rate. Firstly, let's address the reason that the game bounces between 30 and 60 in such a severe fashion. This is basically related to the way in which vertical sync is achieved. The game seems to utilize a double buffer setup as opposed to triple buffering or adaptive VSync, thus any fluctuation from the target frame rate sees a drop to half that of the 60 FPS target. This is the reason that when the drops do occur, they feel so severe because you're going all the way from 60 FPS down to 30. But there's more to this problem. There are definitely situations where slowdown can occur in a way that we might describe as more common, especially in the swamp. But most of the problems seem to center on transitioning between different areas. That means both entering and exiting buildings, caves, and dungeons, or just moving from, say, the village to the plains. My suspicion is that we're looking at some sort of CPU bottleneck here while streaming in new data, including perhaps the lighting data I mentioned earlier. That would also explain why these slowdowns occur, then disappear within the same scene, no matter what is happening on screen. In addition, there's plenty of other minor skips and hiccups along the way, so when you take everything together, the game just doesn't feel as fluid as I feel a Nintendo game should, and that's a shame. It's certainly most evident while exploring the overworld, but it can occur anywhere, which is why it's a problem. Now, I was able to still have a great time with the game, but it's pretty distracting and I hope it can be solved. And of course, portable performance is much the same. The frame rate drops in the exact same manner as it does in docked mode and is equally distracting. So it's kind of a big problem, I'd say. Certainly not game-breaking, but you're going to notice it, and it is unexpected from a first-party release like this. So looking back at the whole game then, I do feel that this was an excellent remake of the original Game Boy game. Yes, it does exhibit technical issues, specifically with the frame rate, but everything else is very well designed, and it's still an extremely enjoyable game. For me, the main thing is that the game feels more constrained, and I mean that in a positive way. So many games these days are built around the idea of everything is bigger. You can go to that mountain, you can go across this massive desert and walk for 20 minutes. The world of Link's Awakening is much smaller in comparison, and everything is somewhat compact, yet it's a very dense and interesting and fun world to explore. As you obtain new tools and weapons to use, it becomes enjoyable to go out and re-explore the world and find new areas that you haven't been able to reach before. And when you get into the dungeons, the puzzles are all very thoughtfully constructed and enjoyable to solve. It's a refined, perfect little slice of Zelda gameplay. For me, it's been years since I revisited Link's Awakening, and this project gave me the chance to replay the game not just on Switch, but in its original Game Boy format as well. For me, the Game Boy was the very first game console that I purchased with my own money. I know it sounds silly now, but this is really a game that means a lot to me. I spent countless hours exploring every inch of the island, searching for every last secret within the game. So for me, I approached this remake with equal parts excitement and trepidation. You always wonder if something you enjoyed so much in the past really still holds up today, especially with a new coat of paint. But I'm happy to say that I felt that magic once again across all formats. And whether you grew up playing the game as I did, or this is your first journey to the island of Koholint, I feel it's a journey worth taking however you choose to do it. And I do believe that this remake stays true to the original. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry, and of course, follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, keep on playing Link's Awakening.